So it was really good to crash into your house this morning. Thank you very, very much for letting us come and talk to you. That's really, really great.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for coming all that way from London.
It's nice to appear in Derby.
Yeah.
So the first thing I wanted to sort of talk to you about was, well, one of the things you say in your book, you say that we human beings are sort of, we're designed, as it were, to thrive on compassion and kindness. I was really struck by that we thrive through compassion and kindness. And of course, I'm really aware, just as you're really aware, of the war in the Ukraine at the moment. And it doesn't look like, does it, at a glance at Europe now, and even more so of European and the world history, it doesn't look like we're thriving on compassion and kindness. I wonder whether we could jump in with how did you get to that idea that that's what we're built to do, and how do you put that alongside the horrors that we're seeing around us just now? I thought we'd start with that larger question.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, a lot depends where you look. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Poland and how people are trying to help refugees, then you would see a lot of compassion and kindness, wouldn't you? So it depends where you look.
Yeah, that's true.
So the key really is to understand the transition that humans made from basic primate through to being human, right? So if you look at most primate societies, not bonobos, but other ones, they're all pretty much dominated through aggression. Aggression is what runs the show. So you've got your dominant males who kind of terrorize all the subordinates. And if the subordinates try to get a bit uppity, then they get whacked. Well, So that's the way it is. Now, what happened was there was a transition during a period of what we call hunter-gatherers. It started a little bit before that. And what happened there was that the subordinates started to gang up against aggressive males and basically kick them out the group. And there's some very interesting work that Sapolsky found in terms of monkeys who got rid of their aggressive males, actually by mistake, because the aggressive males ate some poison food, so they all died off. And the group actually became quite a peaceful group. Now, this is quite important for what comes later when we think about Ukraine. So that's quite important. So the key thing then is to see, so what happened in that transition? So we went from a transition where you had power and dominance really running the roost through to what became hunter-gatherer societies, and that was care and share. Care and share was a way in which we survived by literally caring and sharing for each other. And a lot of our social brain is orientated for sharing and caring. And if you think about people when they're at their happiness, that's when they're at their happiest, where they have relationships they can share and care for. They go out and enjoy being with each other, go to the restaurants or whatever it is, and they share a joke or a story or whatever. So we are basically orientated for that, and that's very important. And we also have a range of physiological systems in our body that's very sensitive to signals of being cared for and being liked and friendships and so on. Unfortunately, what happened was we then invented agriculture. And agriculture changed the game completely, because caring and sharing societies were groups were immediate foraging and returning. There wasn't any storing of resources. People couldn't really have more than anybody else, and so on. But with agriculture, the groups got larger. We could start storing resources. Resources could now be owned. Within a relatively short time, we'd recreated dominant hierarchies again, with dominant males primarily, but not only at the top. And if you look at all of the major civilizations, from the Hittites through to the Egyptians, through to the Romans, through to the Vikings, they're all pretty much the same. Pretty violent societies that suppress the population through terror. If you think of the Romans, the awful crucifixions and stuff that went on there. And we're only just beginning to emerge once again out of being run by terrorist groups, really. Even in Britain as well. We went through a terrible time in the Middle Ages where we hunted down witches and we tortured people and we hung loads of people for simple crimes like stealing a loaf of bread. So we're only really just beginning to think about, well, do we really want to live like this? Or do we want to have a much more sharing and caring society? And that's, so in the last 100 years, I think we've moved on quite a bit. got rid of slavery and all the other horrors that we've managed to create, because we are probably one of the most vicious, nasty species that have ever existed. And we have to understand that. We have a terrible dark side, really nasty dark side. So we're beginning to stand against that. We're beginning to understand the importance of the rule of law and so on. But in a way, Putin is a bit of a throwback in that a typical old-fashioned aggressive male into conquest, into control, into entitlement. And if we don't find ways of subduing and stopping these individuals getting into positions of power, we're always going to be, haunted by them, because we have over the last 5,000 years, right? There's nothing new about Putin. Putin is a classic dominant male. If you look at the Second World War, you had a whole load of them: Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, a whole load of them. Get these guys together. If you look at some of the things that are going on in Myanmar and all other places, where you have these problems all the time, these dominant, aggressive males who are into entitlement and will turn their populations against each other and so on. So that's the issue. So the issue then is, so we can understand it in terms of the process. And the next thing is, how do you bring a compassionate solution? Well, we do actually have solutions. One is, of course, prevention. That's very, very important. And we can talk about how you do that. But the other one is that we probably missed an opportunity in 1991, when the wall came down. Khrushchev, I think, did a fantastic job, and there was an opportunity then to almost treat Russia in the way that we did Germany after the Second World War, which is to not humiliate your enemy, but build them up and make sure they're integrated into democratic societies, because Russia doesn't really have much of a history of democratic societies, but for all kinds of reasons to do with right-wing thinking, that was decided not to go down that route, but rather to go down the route of we're just going to go back to being a primate, and we're going to be stronger than you and more threatening than you, and then you won't be able to do anything, will you? And that was a disaster. So we're coming up to a fork in the road where we have the opportunity again, post-Putin, to integrate, to work, to show compassion to Russia, and how, to be aware that actually they, like all other populations, they just get pulled along by the processes that these dominant males and dominant organizations create. But underneath that, most Russians, like most humans, really would prefer peace, cooperation, integration. And we've got not only have we got Germany and Japan, was another country which has completely changed, but also South Africa have got the truth and reconciliation. So compassion is going to have to go down that road. If you ask me how we stop it, we have to have a very good truth and reconciliation process after the war. How that happens, I'm not quite sure. We've got to be very careful about, once again, starting to say that NATO has to build up its arms and become tough. Yeah, of course, you need to be able to defend yourself if you want to, but your first move, that shouldn't be your first move. Your first move should always be to try as best you can to integrate these societies into democratic, socially just, rule of law, control over the media, control over politics, as best you can. That's how we end up with a peaceful world, really.
Gosh, there's a lot in there that I'd like to explore, but one thing I'll just explore quickly, or perhaps not quickly, is this question of hierarchy and dominant males, and the horrors that we've seen through history. Do you have any sense that there could be a positive hierarchy, where, because haven't we also seen sort of leading males who, I can't actually think of any at the moment, but haven't we seen leading males who aren't acting in that way?
Oh yes, of course there are leading. Nelson Mandela comes to mind, and of course that's true. And then you have Gandhi and various others, and of course then you have the Buddha.
I should have thought of him. So just want to go back to this question of the dominant males that we were just talking about, and history, as you say, is full of that terrible story. And yet at the same time, I think it seems to me that human beings are naturally hierarchical, that you can't sort of get rid of that, as it were. And there are instances, aren't there, of positive hierarchies of male figures or female figures indeed being a very good for. What's your sense of that? What makes a difference, and what would you think about sort of hierarchy generally, from that point of view?
Oh, absolutely. We have a lot of different hierarchies, don't we? We have hierarchies of wisdom, You want to go and see the senior consultant rather than junior or
Yes.
whatever.
Yeah.
So hierarchies are very important. The key issues with hierarchy is what is their function? What are they there to do? And to what extent are they useful to the people below them, or to what extent are they being exploited by the people who have the power? Those are the big issues, really. And of course, the damaging hierarchies are the ones which attract individuals who want to be up the hierarchy because they can advantage themselves, whereas individuals who want power because they can make it of value to other people, that's a different kind of situation. And so you're quite right. I mean, there are many, many hierarchies in everyday life all the time, but those hierarchies work for the benefit of us, not for the detriment.
So I want to, because reading The Compassionate Mind and looking at your work, I wanted to, what strikes me is it feels like a big idea, as in the best sense, that the idea seems to me to be that, what we've said about, we're here to thrive through compassion and kindness. And we'll explore some of the issues that come out of that. But two elements of the big idea I thought would be good just to hear about is something about old brain and new brain that you've talked about quite a lot, and these three systems in the mind. I thought it'd be good just to sort of, because they form to me the sort of basis of the idea, as it were, of compassion. Yeah. So I don't know whether perhaps start with an old brain, new brain.
Yes, well, that's to do with our competencies, because you can make a distinction between things that motivate us, right? Things we want to do, and that's our attention, and that will carry us through our lives. You want to be a good Buddhist, or you want to be a good father or a good psychologist, whatever it is. And then we have our emotions, which come and go. You can have a period of feeling joy or a period of feeling anxious, but they guide your behavior in the moment, but not over many years, really. And then we have what we call competencies. Now, competencies are very important because, for example, birds need wings to fly, but they also need a brain that will guide them. And one of the things that humans evolved very rapidly over about 2 million years is cognitive competencies, which is we call them new brain functions, which is our ability to think and reasons. We have a capacity for understanding the nature of the world and our place in it, vastly superior, as far as we know, might be wrong, than any other animal. We also have capacities for empathy and understanding the mind of the other and recognizing that people behave because they have motives and emotions just like you and I. And we also have this competency for consciousness of consciousness, to be consciously aware that we are aware, which of course is the basis of mindfulness, because without that you can't, can you? And these three give rise to what we call as knowing intentionality. And they're quite fundamental. They are the game changers of life, right? Basically, until humans, as far as we know, life didn't understand itself. It was not conscious of itself, but we are, okay? So, for example, a lion intends to hunt its prey and will do so. So it clearly has intention and motive, but it can't do it knowingly. It can't suddenly decide, you know what, all this hunting is very cruel. I think I'll become a vegetarian. Or I need to train because I'm so unfit, not catching anything these days. But we have knowing intentionality, and part of the meditation process, as you know, is to facilitate our ability for mind awareness and knowing intentionality, so that we can knowingly choose our intention of how to live. And of course, I would say compassionately is very, very important. But in order to do that, we have to be able to have mind aware. So those are what we would call new brain competencies that we don't think other animals have. They might, but we don't think they do. And they're absolutely game changers. And we can use our competencies for good, but also for ill. We can also choose to make weapons of mass destruction or something. And so in that situation, because people often confuse empathy with compassion. Compassion is basically a motivation, a desire, and empathy is a competency, an ability. And you can use empathy in different ways. You to be deceitful, if you
of course,
or to be helpful. If you're very in tune with people, you can work out how you can fool them, as well as how you can help them. So, distinguishing between the different dimensions of mind are very important, and cognitive competencies, our ability to think and reason and understand and have science, and our ability to be empathic, and our ability to be mindful and aware and constantly aware, choose our intention, they're all very important, and they're not necessarily go together. I mean, you can have people who are incredibly intelligent and will win Nobel Prizes, but they're not particularly empathic, nor are they particularly mindful. And equally, you can have some wonderfully empathic people who are never going to win a Nobel Prize because they're just not quite there. You know what I mean? So these are different competencies in the brain. That's why we call them new brain competencies. Yeah.
And then you've got these three. One of the absolute bedrocks for your thinking is these three systems that we have: a threat system, an incentive system, and a soothing system. And I'm particularly struck, by the relationship between affection and kindness and the soothing system.
Yes.
Something that I think I've actually missed out a bit in my life.
Yes.
But let's talk about those three systems a bit, and then perhaps start to look more individually, as it were. Yeah.
Well, for a long time, of course, psychology said positive emotions, negative emotions. That was the way it was. But if you think of emotions from an evolutionary point of view, then emotions need to do three things. And there are all life forms have three basic motives. One motive is to be able to detect and respond to threats. So plants, it would be water, and they curl their leaves to protect themselves from water shortages and so on. Even bacteria in your gut can distinguish between toxic and healthy areas for them, and they move away from the toxic. So this capacity for the detection of threat and the ability to respond to threat when it's detected, that is a fundamental motive for all living things. But of course, also all living things need to be able to get resources. They need to not just to deal with threats, but they need to be able to eat or whatever. And for animals that move, we need to be able to find food and shelter and mates and reproduce and all that stuff. So those are all what we call drive emotions which are really propel you out there to do things, achieve things, and so on and so on. But you can't just spend your whole life either achieving things or running away from predators or whatever. It's also important for the body to be able to rest and digest. And that is for the body to be in a state of more quiescence, where the drive for achieving and doing and obtaining resources, and also for working with threats, is settled. And this other aspect, which is linked to part of the autonomic nervous system we call the vagus, so that you can just then settle and rest, and you're not seeking anything. Now, what we know, so those are your three basic systems, and really they just link on to the three basic life tasks. So your threat system obviously has the emotions of anger and anxiety, those sort of things. The drive system has anticipation, excitement, and various things. And your rest and digest system has what we call the soothing emotions, which is the contentment, the slowing, the grounding, the just being present, the being mode, as it's sometimes called. That's important. So the question you're interested in is very important, which is that as we grow up, our parents have an impact on how those three emotions become developed, cultivated, and regulated. So unfortunately, children who grow up in abusive homes, obviously their threat system becomes very overly stimulated, and they may be very driven to achieve things and do things, but that's partly because of the dealing with the threats. They're trying to work with the threats. So people who've been, in a way, like Putin, people who've had a difficult background, which he did. I think his parents treated him as special, but he lived a very in a lot of poverty. His mother nearly died of starvation. There were lots of rats where he was, and he was a small chap, got bullied a lot. So those then, they seek power because they want control. It's a threat-based process of power, as opposed to a joyful. I just like doing well, like there's the joyful. So joyfulness is extremely important. And how parents do that is through play and affection, and make the child feel, the ability to play, very, very important for children. The ability just to feel, I don't have to worry about, I can just have fun, I can just be, full of beans. And if you watch children, because we've got a grandchild who's just nearly 4 now, I mean, he just runs around, and so a lot of joy, a lot of drive, a lot of joy, jumping up and down, watch me do this, and I can do this. So then that's important. But what parents also do is, through the process of loving and kindness and holding. They also act as a soothing object. So when the child is very distressed, they will soothe the child down. And this capacity to experience others, e.g. your parents, as soothers, they are individuals who will be there that can help you. That means that we have a very different way of dealing with threat. Because most animals, to deal with threat, they have to deal with it by themselves. They run away or whatever. But humans can turn to others for support and help and feelings of kindness. And then that stimulates that rest and digest system. And that rest and digest system then calms down the threat system. That's what it does. It calms it down. So when children don't get those inputs, particularly, they can be left with a sense of disconnection, a sense of yearning, and then a sense of emptiness or loneliness, because the systems are still searching. They're looking for it, right? Because a lot of these systems are what we call lock and key, like, because we talked earlier about Jung, you know, they have a seeking. You know, you're meant to be getting love and affection. That's what you're born for, to get it. So if you don't get it, the caring system doesn't give up. It kind of sits underneath, giving you that sense that actually there's something missing. You need to, you know. When people have that experience, they think, well, maybe I'm not getting love because maybe I wasn't good enough, or I was this, or I was that, or whatever it is. So maybe if I change myself, then I will be able to have a sense of connectedness with other people. Then I will feel part of and a sense of belonging, and I can get joyful, and I can be playful, and all that stuff. So that's how the three systems work, really. But the love and kindness is important for all three of them.
Yeah, I want to let's explore that a bit more before we come to the personal, because one of the things that strikes me again is, well, one of the things, interestingly, exploring your work is that you do talk about childhood, but you also talk very much about social context. In fact, you know, reading The Compassionate Mind, it's quite a long time before we really get to. It's certainly not just all focused on childhood, is it?
That's right.
One of the things that struck me is how much you're talking about how brain is co-created.
Yes, that's right.
How your experience is co-created.
Yes, that's right.
I wonder we might just say something about that. Have social context, because there's a lot about social context in your work, aren't there?
Yes. And I mean, you say it's my idea, which is lovely, but of course there's a huge number of people who, you know, are saying pretty much the same things in certain ways. So that's right. I mean, if you think about, you know, if you and I had been born into Italy, say 2,500 years ago, we wouldn't have thought anything about having slaves and treating them not very well, or going to the Roman games and enjoying people being slaughtered as, oh yeah, good, right? Because that was all part of the culture. And we know that in the way in which we operate within cultures, it can also have an epigenetic effect. Even the genes that get turned on and on in us can be related to the social context in which we are living. So it is extremely important that we think about how we create social context that will facilitate the best in us. And that does require us to have much better education about the nature of the mind and what it is that will facilitate us to move towards compassionate styles of living, because we're not living in hunter-gatherer societies now. So we live in a very different world, but we do need a hunter-gatherer type brain, that caring and compassionate brain to texture our relationships. So that's very important.
I mean, the other striking thing is your critique. I mean, there's a social critique in your work, but also quite an interesting critique of excitement itself, and of, you know, going back to those three systems that, in my own experience, I think I've been in some ways quite driven. You know, driven to achieve things, driven to succeed, and so on. And one of the things that I was struck by, you know, in my exploration of your work is the downside of that. This has an upside, obviously, but the downside of that. I wonder whether you might say a little bit about that, and then we'll talk a bit more.
Sure. So what did you perceive as your downside for that?
Well, I definitely felt driven, you know, that sense of, because I think, you know, to sort of talk more personally, that I felt that I needed to be a someone.
Yes.
You know, I didn't quite know what that meant.
Yes.
And it was always a disappearing horizon.
Yes.
And I'd often have this sense of achieving something which other people would say was great, but it didn't please me by the end.
Yes.
If anything, I felt worse for it sometimes.
Yes.
And then that would often drive me to think, okay, well, I can do
Yes.
more.
Yes.
You know, I could, that could be better. I can always tend to see
Yes.
how things
Yes.
could be better.
Yes.
You know,
Yes. Yes.
I don't know what you say to
No,
that.
no, it's a great question. So the point about it is, you we're always in a catch-22 when we're like that, right? Because we're trying to earn a sense of connectedness. Basically, we're trying to have a sense of loneliness and or disconnection or whatever for reasons that you would know. So the brain then thinks, hang on a moment, but I can win the ticket. I can work it out. You know, if I become X or Y, then people are going to really like me, aren't they? That's great, isn't it? Right? The catch-22 is that, yeah, but there's a part of you that knows you're buying it. And therefore it's not genuine, because if tomorrow you fail, then they're not going to bother again, are they? So you have to keep it up, don't you? See? So although it gives you a short-term buzz, it can't give you a long-term buzz because it's the wrong system. It's in the drive system. It's not in the green system. So it can't give you that sense of connectedness because people want you, because just you, regardless of whether you succeed, whether you fail, it doesn't really matter. It's just you we're interested in. That's all we're interested in. It's difficult to get that feeling of just I'm okay as I am right now, you know. So, you know, part of what psychotherapy does is to help, and what Buddhism does as well, is to help you understand you're okay as you are. And yeah, if you can do things and people like it, that's kind of cool. I rather like it. But that aspect, that there's a sense and understanding, both consciously and unconsciously, that if this is the only way I can get accepted, it's not worth anything. Because the moment I can't do it anymore, you'll forget me, won't you? You won't want me anymore.
Yeah, I'd like to continue talking more personally, because one of the reasons I wanted to be able to meet you here in Derby is to thank you. I feel a sort of personal gratitude to you, because, you know, to share a sort of slightly personal story, but, you know, we're all persons, aren't we? So why not? You know, I've been practicing Buddhism for many, many years. And I kept on finding myself in the same kind of problem. I would be in meetings where I'd feel that something very important was at stake, and I needed to speak up for that important thing, or I could see that it could be better. I'd then get sort of rather hot about that and upset about that. People would then sort of withdraw from me, and then I felt then I'd get hotter and more confused at trying to explain what I was trying to see. And then I'd feel quite ashamed of that afterwards and wish I hadn't done it and so on. So out of that repeating experience, a friend of mine suggested CFT, compassion focus therapy, that you've created. And I mean, I've been doing it for a few years now, and I found it's made a huge difference. So I do feel, you know, personally grateful to you. Without you knowing, you have actually helped me.
That's
you know,
wonderful. Thank you so much.
And me to me is quite important. You've really actually helped me.
That's great.
And you see how that is. I really struggled with wanting to be helped, because I've been practicing Buddhism, and I've been doing this practice called the Maitreyabandhu, which I thought we might explore a bit in a moment. And you'd think I should be able to do that. You know, and there was something I was tripping up on. Don't know I don't know whether that strikes anything for you, whether I could ask you more questions about that. But
yeah, no, I think it's a wonderful question, because I think people do look to these practices almost for psychic healing, you know, psychological healing, which sometimes it can be, but it's like saying, you know, I've been going to the gym, I'm super fit, but I've still got my ankle still hurt. And you say, yes, because you've got tendinitis, right? Actually, you want to do less exercise, not more. So a lot of the Buddhist practices really are about developing this deeper wisdom of knowing intentionality, insight into the nature of mind, and so on and so on. But they're not specifically designed to address underlying emotional problems, partly because in the Buddhist traditions, they don't exist. I mean, you know, as the Dalai Lama says, you know, if you're part of a monastery and you're part of a connected community, you're part of the Sangha, I mean, you are part of it, you know, why would you have a sense of you're not? So they don't, it's the Western society that has this serious problem with people feeling disconnected and detached and not part of, and the drive to be part of, which is, but in the Buddhist communities, of course, that just wasn't the way. That didn't exist like that. So we need to have a therapeutic process that would address the fractures in the attachment system or the problems that people have, and the ways in which they try to compensate, which is, you spoke brilliantly, elegantly about that. But as you say, part of the problem is that there's an urgency in it, an urgency to recognize me, to accept me, to see I've got the good, I've got the right, I can sort it, you've got to do all of that stuff, which is really coming from this deeper level of a need for connectedness, really. That's where it is, you see. And so in the CFT, what we would do is, as you probably know, we take all that, we'd say, oh, that's really interesting. Let's just talk to the self that wants to kind of get hold of the committee and say, do it this way, without shaming them. Okay, so let's explore that. Let's really take a compassion to this part of you that wants to say those things to people, relatively playful, and allow you just to really explore what is that drive about. Because when you really explore what that drive is about, rather than being ashamed of it and I should be doing this, then you get in touch with the underlying. That takes you into your own anger, but it'll also take you into grief. Then the grieving will facilitate the process of allowing you to open and then have a different relationship with other people. But the grieving in CFT, as you know, is very, very important, because all of these things are rooted in a deep fracture in the sense of self in relationship to others.
You know, I've been really struck by that fracture. You know, for instance, when I first came to Buddhism, I was taught the Maitreyabandhu practice. I don't know whether you've heard about that, but the cultivation of loving kindness. And it starts with cultivating loving kindness to yourself, very like CFT, and then, you know, loving kindness for all beings. Actually, for me, it made matters worse, because I came to Buddhism with a very, very self-critical, even at times I think self-hating habit. Nobody's fault, you know, it wasn't my parents' fault, but you know, they were very busy. I have three older brothers. I have a younger sister. My parents worked full time in their own business. So, you know, and I think looking back on it, that something didn't happen quite. It wasn't their fault. But I was struck by, you know, I was doing the Maitreyabandhu practice, trying to, you know, they said, okay, develop loving kindness for yourself. I thought, yes, I definitely need that. Develop loving kindness for all beings. Yes, that's definitely the thing to do. And guess what? I can't do it. So here's another thing I can't do. And then someone said to me, well, just spend all the time just developing loving kindness for yourself. And that made it worse still, because then it was like, you can't even get past the first stage of this. So what happened is, just to be confessional, is I just gave up doing it. It just seemed to make matters worse. And it was only by having CFT that I started approaching that again. So why didn't that work? Because you could think, okay, develop compassion for yourself. For me, that really didn't work. For me, it actually increased my sense of self-problematization, because I saw that it was valuable, as I said, and I couldn't do it. At least that's what I believed. What would you have said to me then? You know.
Well, firstly, I think it's a wonderful thing you say, you know, the reasons for thinking about what is it that makes self-compassion so difficult.
Yes.
Very, very, very important message, because it's very difficult for a lot of people. And there are different reasons for that. There are different things going on to do with that. So, you know, in therapy, we try to explore what that's about. What do you feel if you start to do it, and so on and so on. But in CFT, there's always the big three in CFT, linked to the threat system, which is anger, fear, and sadness. Those are your big three. And so when you run into any block like this, you've always got these operating under the surface. So in therapy, what we would do, we would begin to explore what that's about. And the key thing is helping you to help you be a little playful, because if you come from the back, once you can be a little playful, that loosens it up, and then you can begin to think about, you know, this loving kindness, because you can have some fun with it. You can say, yeah, but do I have to be loving the kind to assholes? I mean, even assholes? I mean, are you serious? So the key thing is loosen it up a little bit, and then you say, okay, so let's think about that. So what is it about? And then we sometimes find underneath of it, there is so much unprocessed rage and sadness that it's just not possible, because really what that Maitreyabandhu is doing, if you're not careful, it'll start to try to cover it up. It's like it'll start to kind of, you know, rather than actually, no, you need to experience this. I mean, you need to be able to be okay with your raging. That's all right. and you can be compassionate to your raging, you know. So sometimes when we work with people have that, we really facilitate their ability to rage, you know, to literally say "fuck you" and really feel that, you know. So they can be compassionate to the fact that as a human being, they have that degree of pain, or they can just cry or whatever. That there isn't anything that compassion can't take to. But if you try to kind of impose it in a sense and not listen to those hurt parts of yourself, right? Not take them and say, I want to know about your rage. Talk to me about your rage. Fuck you, part of you. Then that's when the meditations get into trouble, I think.
I mean, that's really, for me, I think it's more fear and sadness, although perhaps there's rage there as well. I've got plenty of that as well.
Yes.
But yeah, let's do the whole three, you know.
Let's do the whole thing.
But it was, I think looking back, I was trying to sort of pump it up.
That's right.
You know, let's just be well. I may, you know, you the traditional phrase, may I be well, may I be happy, may I be free from something. Absolutely believe in that.
Yes.
But in some way, I didn't believe in that.
Yes.
And I just tried to pump it up. And then for me, it just created a sense of I can't do this.
Yes.
And I've already got a long list of things I can't do.
Yes.
And feeling love for myself has now been added to the list.
Yes.
Which is a very unhappy consequence of that.
Yes. So it's a great question, because we all also, as you probably know, we don't go anywhere near love, and not so much to kindness in the beginning, because we often depressed people can't. They really, it's almost toxic to them. So in our view of compassion, we talk about being sensitive to suffering and being committed to try to do something about it. Whether that will involve kindness or not, we don't know. That's down the road. But the first thing is, let's be sensitive to your suffering. Let's see what the nature of your suffering is about. Let's see where the wounds are. Let's see what the feelings are around that. And then we bring the wisdom of compassion to that. So now then, how would we hold that? How would we be with that? Okay. And that then it becomes a way in which we then allow, facilitate, soften, if you want to use that word, and work through those, because it's all wounds, you see. It's all to do with wounds, right? Healing the wounds, particularly when the wounds bite you.
And then they bite other people, don't they?
They bite other
they
people,
don't just stick with you.
That's why there's always the three. You see, there's always the anger there, because the anger slips out from time to time. You can see it, that anger there, and it can come out. But the key thing is always, whatever the dark side of your mind, remember, you never built your brain. You never chose to have that brain, to do that. You didn't choose any of that. So the key thing is just to say, okay, let me just find this. Let me work with my dark side, my raging. And then that is what moves you. We have, I'll give you an example of another common reason that people get into trouble is because the rage can actually slip over into sadistic fantasy. Let's see if they have sadistic fantasies about wanting to hurt people, or they enjoy watching horror films or whatever. Then they say, I can't be compassionate to that. I'm so full of shit. I can't be compassionate to that. I can't be compassionate to myself. I'm just not a nice person, I can't. So that's going to be another process. And then you have to do the same ththing again. Okay, so let's think about what it is about you that's not nice. And how can we be compassionate to that? Right? And so on and so on.
Which is interesting. So, because I come to some of the more resistances to self-compassion in a minute. But the other thing that I noticed doing CFT, it has been, I think, very important for me to doing CFT, thanks to you, was because I've had psychotherapy before, and although I valued it, what I ended up with feeling is like, I've talked about my difficult childhood. I can be quite, I'm fairly aware of that, and I can talk without blame about my childhood, but it didn't seem to make much difference after a certain point. I talked about what I felt at times, and this might have been my problem rather than the therapies that I've tried, but, I ended up feeling, I had better explanations for why I was often depressed and unhappy, which was my history. But I didn't change that very much. I'd still feel rotten and unhappy, but I could tell you more about its etiology. And it felt in CFT that it was, but then I've also done, sort of CBTs and things like that, where for me it felt a bit thin, a bit like, oh yes, well, do you replace this thought with that thought? for me, it felt, I don't know, again, it might be my fault rather than the therapist, but, you know, a bit too cognitive, a bit more like, well, here's the answer to this question. Perhaps I was, but CFT seemed to be somewhere between that to me. There seemed to be an exploration of my past and an empathy for that. I was struck by my therapist being quite empathic and feeling that I could talk to them. He was saying, "Look, I can't pronounce your name," and I said, "That's the first qualification. I don't want to be seeing a therapist who can pronounce my name.
Yes.
I didn't want a Buddhist, in other words.
Yeah.
I wanted another vision from myself." Is that your sense of CFT that somewhere, because it seems to have it has talking in it, obviously, but it also has practices. And also, I'd be given, it was my therapist who then said, "How about you? There must be something in Buddhism that you could help you with." And I thought, well, I had this Maitreyabandhu practice, but I gave that up years ago. And he had, my whole friends were laughing at me because finally, after 30 years, I had to pay somebody to tell me to do a practice I'd been taught 30 years before. Anyway, just what do you think? Is CFT somewhere between those two? What's your sense of? There's a bit of an argument, isn't there, between psychotherapy and psychology?
Yes, no, I mean, there are a lot of wisdoms in different therapies, and we do use a lot of CBT because we do help people think about how they're conceptualizing, thinking about the world, and so on. But we're motivation based, so we're interested in the caring motivational system because that both physiologically and psychologically will organize your mind, and that is where humans are really rooted, right, in our ability to be caring and accept caring. The problem is that just understanding it isn't necessary. It can help, but it isn't necessarily going to move you. How is it that you then experience caring coming in, somebody who genuinely cares about you? Now, the therapeutic relationship is very, very important for that. But one of the exercises that we do, of course, is compassionate image and practicing what it is to have a compassionate image and learning what compassion is. Now, when you start off with compassionate image, you think, oh, compassionate image is going to be kind and nice to me. But later on, you realize that you can just swear at it. So that you can just let yourself go, just have a tantrum if you want. And the compassion image is always there. It accepts you whatever, right? If you're going to have a tantrum, you have a tantrum. And so the whole point about it is you begin to try to create in your mind an experience of receiving, okay? Because you giving compassion to yourself, if those early attachments are a little bit fractured, that's very hard. It has to come from the outside first. So the therapeutic relationship is part of it, but also practicing compassion imagery and just practicing imagining talking to an individual who you would regard as a most compassionate person who will accept you come what may. Okay, that's the key thing. Come what may, come what may. So, and as you know, a lot of my compassion is based on rage because I think a lot of biological life is pretty horrible. All life has to be other life. We're very vulnerable to diseases and injuries. So you just think of COVID. I mean, what a nasty little thing, bit of DNA that just goes around killing people. It's not very nice to that. But there's loads of these viruses out there. We don't live for very long, and the Buddha's Four Noble Truths obviously are very, very important. Everything is impermanent and so forth. We're full of all these illusions. So, there's a part of me that says, who the fuck designed this? I mean, shoot the bastard, So compassion calls us actually into, yes, but now nature had no mind, but you do. So now it's up to you to understand it and now bring a new kind of way for nature to be, which of course, in my view, would be the compassionate position.
I want to talk a bit about the resistances to that, because when I first sort of started CFT, I was very, very resistant to it. I mean, like really resistant to it. Eventually, I had to apologize for being so resistant to it.
That's good. Resistance is good.
What's your sense of it? Because you'd think that people would, and I and anyone watching would be, okay, self-compassionate sounds really good. Clearly, we need to be more compassionate. And I mean, you only need to glance at the world to think we need to be more compassionate. Why is it so difficult? And what are the resistances personally to it that you've seen?
Yeah, well, we call them fears, blocks, and resistances. So the fears are really yeah, but I don't know what it will do. I don't think it can help me. What will I become? I'll be letting myself off the hook, all kinds of resistance. And the blocks are the fact that people simply don't know what it is, right? They have all kinds of strange ideas about compassion. Particularly if they get it off the internet, if you have compassion, you've got to love, you've got to have this love. No, you don't. You do not need love. Love is good. I'm all in favor of love, but what you need is this dedication. It's the Buddhist position, this dedication to be sensitive to suffering in all sentient beings with a commitment to seek to alleviate it and the causes. Right? It's not what is what's the actual thing? Sensitivity to suffering and its causes.
And its causes, yeah.
I used to know this off heart. It's gone out of my mind now. So that's the key. That's what it is. Whether you love people or whether you don't is irrelevant.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's really important.
Very, very important. It's irrelevant. It's just this dedication to try as best you can to be sensitive to suffering where you see it, try to understand its causes and do what you can to relieve it, and certainly not to cause it. You don't want to be a cause of suffering if you can possibly help it. So that's it. Whether you love people, whether you don't, doesn't really matter. So like, doctors, they don't need to love all their patients, but they want to be as professional with everyone coming through the door. They'd be the same professional support as they possibly can. So that's very important, because love in the West means you have to like and all of that stuff. In the Tibetan concept, of course, is benevolence, which is a different concept. The concept of benevolence, the benevolent wish, and it's got slightly translated, I think, incorrectly with this concept of loving kindness. Metta is a sort of thing, but it's more benevolent kindness, a wish for you to be free of suffering. And I would do what I can to help you.
In a way, irrespective whether you like that person or agree with them.
Very much so. That's absolutely right. And that has implications for later if we get into the Ukraine. But so that is very, very, very important. So first of all, then sometimes you have to clear out all this stuff that you don't need to like yourself particularly. Okay. Why do you need to like yourself? You get up in the morning, you have a shit. Do you like that? Not particularly. My body has to do it, so I have to do it cleanly, but I don't need to like it. So understanding that, I'm a biological being that's been built, and I've got all these things about me. I've got 2 arms and 2 legs. They're getting arthritic now and so on. But I don't need to like it. It is what it is, right? But what I can do is to treat it with respect and try to do what I can to minimize suffering, so I don't cause myself too much pain, really, and so on and so on. So the key, I think, is understanding this sensitivity of what the Buddha says is that life is about suffering. That's what it's about, right? And in my view, at the center of the Buddhism, how do we deal with the life of suffering? This short life that's full of desires for grasping, that's full of pains and diseases and sorrows and losses. How do we deal with that, right? And the Buddha said, as I understand, it's our reactions to these things that can actually step it up, so we can have a lot more dukkha than we need to by how we think about these things, right? So I think, so from my point of view, it's got a little bit tricky when people start thinking about love and all that stuff.
That's really
you want to strip it back.
I was really struck by that it's to do with sensitivity of suffering and a desire to minimize it. And that in a way is it's at least straightforward in one sense.
Yes, that's right.
Because the other thing that looking at my own sort of slightly complicated sort of resistance to it is, and I don't know what you think of this, but I was concerned. Partly I thought, do you know what, I don't want to go into my difficult childhood again. I've done it lots of times and it hasn't made much difference. And I had this sense that, look, I've got a limp. I can manage, I can still do stuff, good stuff, but I've got a limp, and that's just how it's going to have to be. One of the things I realised, looking at your own work, is, and of course I should know, is that the brain is always plastic. So you're not stuck with something. No. You're not stuck with that. I'm 60 now and I still can change my mind.
Yeah, very much so. I
mean, the assumption is that you can't, isn't it?
Yes.
That you can't teach an old dog new tricks.
Yes. But that's not the case. We now know this thing called neuroplasticity, that we can change our brains. But also, when you get different types of insight, you can suddenly change quite almost overnight. A particular kinds of insight can really help you. Like if you were talking, you would get quite, you had this monitoring system, this critical system that was constantly telling you can't do, you're no good, you can't do, you're no good, you can't do. So one of the things is to slow it down and say, okay, critic, I want to have an interview with you. I'm going to interview you, okay? So tell me, what do you actually think? See, and then the critic says, I think you're useless, I think you're this. All right, then. So what do you feel about me? I think you're pathetic. I just got contempt for you. And what do you want to do to me? I want to shake you, wake you up. So when we do meet your critic, what we find is that the critic carries a lot of the hostile energies, the sadistic, attacking energies. And so, okay, that's all right. They can do that. And then you want to get behind them. So what's this about then? And then, of course, when you get behind it, you realize that actually there's a lot of wounds that sit behind the critic. So the process is that if you just have loving kindness, right, do that, you're not dealing with that hostility that the critic is carrying, and then you're not getting to the next part, which is all of the wounds that sit behind it. And that allows you then to be compassionate to that fighting critic, but actually at the same time saying, yeah, I can see that, but I'm not going to take it on board because that's harmful to me, you know what I mean? I can see you're very angry at me. I can see that. Then you're carrying all my wounds and all my pain. I can see that. But actually, that's not going to help me, so I'm not going to take it on. Is that okay? You have a sort of slightly playful, but also this taking it less seriously, allowing yourself just to settle, to become less serious about yourself, and to realize as a human being, we've got all this crazy crap going on in our heads. And so does a lot of the Western society. So it's not just about me, particularly if we've had very fractured attachment history. So that's not my fault either. So by having this orientation, it allows that genuine compassionate self to then start to come through. Because the compassionate self not trying to suppress anything, and it has the courage and the wisdom to actually deal with any of your dark sides. So,
I mean, the other thing that struck me was because in working with people, one of the things that again I was a bit resistant to compassion was I've met quite a few people who under the guise of saying they're compassionate to themselves won't help. I don't know whether where you're trying to look. Could you help? Oh no, I need
yes.
I need to be kind to. I keep meeting people who need to be kind to themselves, and they need to learn to say no.
Yes.
And I'm afraid that can often mean is that they don't help people very much.
Yes.
So that's turned me off self-compassion.
Yes.
You know what I mean? I need to be. I'm being kind to myself.
Yes.
The amount of people I meet who say they're learning to say no.
Yes.
I'd like to meet a few people who learn to say yes. I don't know whether where that fits in self-compassion, but that was one of my resistances to it.
Yeah, no, I think that's again a basic misunderstanding about what compassion is, about the whole idea about that. I mean, the key thing really is that the more you can give people, if you give with a joyful heart, you don't get exhausted really. It's when you don't give with a joyful heart, then you say, I'm sorry, I've done my 10 minutes of compassion today, you've had it, right? I try to be compassionate to one person every day, but unfortunately you're not that person.
So you've got compassion fatigue, isn't it?
Yeah, so people talk about that, and you see it all the time, these self-care movements, when they just say, I have to be compassionate to myself, you know what I mean? I've got to look after myself. I mean, that's a complete misunderstanding about what compassion is, really, because it's not quite like that.
Why is it not? Because it can sound like you just mean be nicer to yourself, have longer baths, get some body rub,
Yes.
Why is it? Why? What's the difference? The primary difference?
Well, see, I will always come back to the basic definition. It's sensitive to suffering. So be aware of your own suffering and to what degree you are causing it, right? So your critic is causing you a lot of suffering, right? So you don't want to ban it or get rid of it. You want to go and interview it. So why are you causing me this much pain? Why do you keep challenging me and telling me I'm no good and I can't do anything? What's this about? Why would you want to do that? Because you're just inflicting a lot of pain, right? So I want to find out, what is this pain, the desire to make me suffer? Why are you wanting to do that? So that's, for me, one of the key dimensions of self-compassion, is that we become aware of our own dark sides that we can launch against ourselves, and that when we learn to stop doing that and actually have a genuine desire to be sensitive to our own suffering and for us to flourish as best we can. That's what self-compassion is. Now, the degree to which you then want to go and say to people, oh, I'm so sorry, I can't be compassionate today. I've done my 5 minutes. I'm done. You know, I mean, I you know, we've got therapists, I think therapists say, oh, I have to treat myself with compassion. I can only see 3 or 4 patients a day because I just got to have self-care, look after myself. Well, that's okay. But my view always was see as many as you can until you get tired and then don't do it anymore. End of story.
Sensible.
What is all this? I got to look after myself. So,
well, that self-care thing seems to me can just get so tight.
It does get very tight.
It's like it's a bargain with life all the time.
Yes, yes.
Oh, do I not talk to you very much because I need to conserve something for later?
That's exactly the point. That they see it as like giving out something that's, you know, I've got £100 here. Once I've spent it, that's gone. But compassion is not like that. In fact, what you find is the more you give out, the more actually it fills you up, the more joy you can have, actually. So, yeah, I mean, you've got to be sensible with compassion, of course. I mean, it's like if you go to somewhere in the world where they're starving and you give all your food away, so you end up starving too. That's probably not terribly sensible, but you just got to be sensible, really.
We'll come on to that a bit more in a minute. But the other thing I wanted to mention was, what was it? I mean, I keep going to my mind and it floats off again. Oh, yeah, you know, this thing about self-criticism, and I mean, it is striking how many people, I mean, I want to say how many people I meet who are very self-critical.
No, it's very common in the West.
I'm one of those people, so I can hardly.
No, it's very common.
You know, but also there's something really good about, you know, I was thinking artists are very self-critical. Musicians, you know, you play the guitar, I know. Musicians are very self-critical. Scientists presumably are very critical. You know, presumably you're not arguing against self-criticism.
No, this is a wonderful question. Because self-criticism is extremely important. It's all to do with the motivation. So hostile self-critics really are just to undermine you and make you feel bad and punish you. That's what they're about. You're no good. You're this. But compassionate self-criticism is to actually inspire you to do better, right? So like if I playing guitar and not doing very well, I can get frustrated. But then my compassionate self says, yeah, okay, well, just settle down and then maybe tomorrow have another go and see if you can do it. Look, you know, look at this video or whatever it is. So the key thing about self-criticism is the ability to perceive error, because you actually want to do that. You don't want to be deceived. Nobody wants to be deceived. If I'm not doing any good or I'm making mistakes, I absolutely want to know that. But then the next question is, so what am I going to do? Well, the compassionate self says, well, then let's improve. Let's do better. Let's have another go. Let's see what we can do, right? And we've done quite a lot of research to show that individuals who are quite driven, if they're driven with this positive emotion to do well, not the fear of not doing well and bashing themselves about, but they just want to do well and they get joy from doing well, they quite enjoy seeing where they've gone wrong and then they have another go, you know.
Because the assumption could be, oh, you know, I'm practicing my guitar, I feel awful about it, I'm rubbish at this, and I'm going to practice self-care, so I'll stop playing the guitar because it makes me feel awful. And that's not what you're saying, it seems to me.
No, not at all, no. What I'd say to that person is you put your standards too high. You're not playing the guitar. You're not learning to play the guitar. You're learning to try to be a certain kind of guitar player. Right, that's not the same thing.
Right.
Unless I can play like this, you know, I can play like the other Paul Gilbert. I'm not quite as good as him. The other guitar players that I'm not one of you. But when you play the guitar, let's see if you can you make a note sound interesting? Can you make 2 notes sound interesting? Then you're playing the guitar, right?
Yeah, that's really.
So that's the point then, that in our society, when we don't want to go through the steps, you know, we want to play the guitar for 3 months and then have the experience of playing for 20 years. We want to play like a 20-year player. You can't do that, right? And so part of the compassion is the wisdom to realize that everybody starts at the beginning. There are steps to every practice, and you cannot be further ahead than you can be. That's it.
I want to really come back to that wisdom side, because one of the other things that strikes me about compassion focused therapy and your work is the wisdom side of compassion. But I keep wanting to rehearse my resistances. Sorry, was
No,
that?
please. Yeah. Resistances or wisdoms in our approach. They're the wisdoms, and you've got to. We try to find out what that wisdom is, right? Because you're not resistant just to be awkward. There's a reason for it, okay? Because there is a fracture or a hurt or a wound somewhere, okay? It's like a dog. If you go to stroke it and it backs away, it's probably got a nail in its paw or something, right? So,
see, one other resistance was this fear of being self-indulgent. Now, again, I'm not saying. Obviously not saying that self-compassion is self-indulgent, but there is such a thing as sort of being, is there not, something about being overly preoccupied with yourself?
yes.
And I sort of feel that when I was young, I was very much preoccupied with the feeling of being a victim.
Yes, yes.
Of my brother's aggression, of, I'm gay from a small town where at that time that was, a horrible thing,
yes.
So I've grown up with this sort of sense of being a victim, and then looking back on it, I was indulged that a lot. So one of my resistances to self-compassion was I didn't want to go back to an indulgent place of, in my case, self-pity and so on. But self-pity can feel a bit like self-compassion, weirdly.
Yes.
It's like you're trying to do that, but in this kind of narcotic way. I don't know what you think about self-indulgence and self-pity.
Yes, well, be compassionate to it.
Yeah.
Okay, because the key thing always is not to put your mind against yourself, right? So I shouldn't be indulgent. Well, why not? You can be indulgent if you want to. It's all right. You be indulgent. See what that's about. What's that about? So the moment you're trying to stop yourself and say, I don't want to do that, I shouldn't do that. Whereas the compassion will allow you to just move yourself to a position where, well, I don't want to. It's not relevant. I'm not interested in being self-indulgent. It's not relevant.
It's not much fun.
It's not much fun, right? So it's not about I have to stop myself. If I let myself be compassionate, then I'll become self-indulgent. It's not quite like that. It's recognizing if you become self-compassionate, you're not interested in self-indulgence, particularly.
And I've even started to feel something more of that. It's just not so, because I was weirdly attracted to that as well.
Yes.
I thought it was terrible and sort of kept getting stuck in it.
Yes,
particularly self-pity.
Yes.
It can feel like it's going to help, but it never does.
No.
Never does.
But the key thing always is when you get something like self-pity or whatever, is always try to see it as a wisdom in the sense of, let me open this up, let me see what this is about, right? Rather than trying to, I shouldn't be like that or push it away. Let me just see what this is about, self-pity. Well, humans have self-pity, so I want self-pity. If everybody else can have it, I want it, I don't want to be the only one without self-pity. What's ridiculous? So you kind of take this view that whatever's turning up in your mind, that you would then take a compassionate position to it, not fight with it or suppress it or tell you you're bad or criticize yourself for it. And when you do that, you decide, nah, don't really want to do that.
That's much better, isn't it? So look, we've been talking quite a lot about the resistances to self-compassion, but I want to, we're better. I'm also aware I'm using more of your time.
We're fine for time. I put some other things put some things back.
I want to go to the question of wisdom, because self-compassion has, even the word compassion has a very emotional flavor, obviously, and it can easily be mistaken, I think, with being nice to yourself, a self-care movement that's, if we're not careful, Buddhism will get dissolved back into, which I don't think works. My instinct is that self-care doesn't work. It creates, what I see, it creates anxiety and sort of, a sort of frozenness almost at times, that I've only got, like you say, I've only got so much to spend, and I probably spent most of it now, and I need to be in a vacuum sealed bubble or something for the next one. How did you get to this wisdom element of compassion? Because it seems to be as much about growing as anything.
Yes.
And really living out your potential.
Yes.
And how it seems to be a pragmatic way of how do you do that without turning against yourself?
Yes.
I used to think if I told myself off enough for doing things, feeling sorry for myself, getting into a big mood about things, which I used to do very much, I'd stop doing it. And of course it never worked.
Yes.
But that's the instinct, isn't it? I'll tell myself off and then I'll stop doing it.
Yes.
How did you get from sort of to that wisdom element?
It's a great question. I don't know that I can answer it. I think, interestingly, because I was at boarding school and had all the stuff there that goes on, the abuses and stuff like that, and I was always quite an angry person. No, I wasn't angry with people, never angry with people. I think I was always, quite fun to be with people, but underneath, I was always quite an angry person and very anti-authority, and I just would never put up with a self-critic. If a self-critic tried to be authoritative, I said, fuck off, right? What are you doing? I mean, that. So I was never that kind of person that was very self-critical. I just wasn't. I mean, I get frustrated with myself, of course. I get annoyed and because I do things, I say, oh, you fool, why have you done that? But never really had a strong sense of being either particularly good or particularly bad. I just carried on through life, really. And so I think the other thing is that people try so hard, because self-criticism often comes from effort.
Yes,
There's deep effort under there, whereas I wasn't ever like that.
I mean, why is it that self-criticism is now, it seems to be epidemic?
Yeah, it's a very competitive society, you see. And the competitive motivational system is a monitoring system, all the time monitoring how good you are compared to Sue, compared to Jane, compared to Fred. Are you good? Are you like them? Are you not like them? So we're taught from a very early age from school to compare ourselves to other people all the time. And that social comparison drives a lot of self-criticism, particularly in the young.
I'm seeing it in teenagers very much.
It's a great tragedy. All wanting to be better. I want to be better. Then I'll be loved. Then I'll be accepted. If I'm better, then I can be cool. I can be this. I can be that. I can be part of the group and all of that stuff. And it's all to do with the competitiveness. This neoliberal nonsense that we're into at the moment. And that's quite a major problem for the young people.
And social media presumably has ramped that up massively. Because you can now compare yourself with thousands of people rather than the 5 friends that you've got or whatever.
That's right. I mean, in hunter-gatherer societies, Robin Dunbar has done brilliant work on this. I mean, about 150 people were in the group, 100 to 150. You know them from the day you were born to the day you die, right? So there wasn't any kind of this social competition. You just had fun with them and went hunting with them or...
And presumably you knew their strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, you just
didn't
knew
idolize one person.
No, that's right. Everybody had a place, and there was a place for everybody. And the child rearing was very different. There was the whole group would raise children. They would be responsible. We wouldn't have these sort of locked up in these homes where you've only got your parents who can batter you or whatever. Yeah. So it's an interesting question. I've never been particularly self-critical, disappointed, of course. I'd like to be a better guitar player. Of course, that's true. But I always found the world. There was always a sense that there was something seriously wrong with the world. Always had that feeling since I was very, very young. This shouldn't exist. That sort of sense. When I was in Africa, I remember some of the things there when I saw how they used to kill animals and stuff. And one day somebody visited, because we lived in the outback, we didn't have any running water or anything. My father had been very traumatized by the war. He'd been in the RAF and decided he didn't want to stay in Europe and took a job in Africa. This person with leprosy came and it's terrible. And I remember that haunted me for a while. And just thinking, oh, this shouldn't be. People shouldn't have to experience this. You know what I mean? So I always had that very quite strong sense that this is not right. And then in '95, I watched the documentary on the Holocaust. It was the 50-year anniversary of the Holocaust, and it was one of the BBC specials. And they do these things so brilliantly well, don't they? With all the music and everything, and what went on in the camps and everything. And I mean, I cried for about 2 hours, and I was never the same. No, I was not the same. I just thought, this is seriously wrong. Humans are seriously fucked up. Seriously fucked up. If you can do that on the scale that you're doing it, that's serious. We have to stand against this dark side. We have to. So that partly is after '95. That's when you start to see a lot of the push to study compassion. So compassion must be the way that we can go. How does it work? What do we do? How do we make it happen? How does it work in the brain?
Well, as you say, because one of the things about those Holocaust documentaries that one should always remember is that you could have been on either side.
Yes.
You know,
Yes. Yes.
you could have been in the Jewish in the camps, and you could have been the
Yes.
commandant.
That's
you know,
extremely important point.
it's so easy to sort of think that you would be always on the good side of history.
Yes, that's right.
And one of the wisdoms of your approach, I think, is to
Yes.
completely look at the,
Yes.
as you would say, the dark side of
That's
our
right. Because we've often been on the other side of history. You know,
Mm.
we've often been the slave traders, what we did in India and so on and so on. So no, you know, there is no escaping. Every human being has the potential to be a Buddha or a Hitler. Perhaps not quite as extreme as those, but they on a dimension.
Yeah, somewhere in that sort of
somewhere
in that sort of spectrum.
And it's partly luck in a way. You know, if you get born into, or you get a certain genetic hand, and you get born into a certain environment, certain family, certain culture, you're more likely to go to the dark side.
So I want to sort of, we'll better start to draw this close, but we're talking quite a lot about self-compassion, and I do think that is very, very important. I've experienced it as being important in my life, and one of the reasons I wanted to meet you is because I'd like more people to know about your work and CFT, because I meet lots of people like me are very self-critical, depressive types, you know, and you know, I've harmed myself and I've harmed other people through that. You know, and it'd be nice not to do that anymore. That's right. On balance, you know. That's right. But you know, we're talking here, and we're you know we're in war in Europe again. You know, and what on earth can we do? Here we are again, and you know, I've got friends whose parents are in Ukraine, and you know, I was going out for a coffee with one friend, and I'd just met another friend whose parents were packing their car to drive to Poland. And I had that same instinct that we can't be doing this. We can't be in this divided world where my friend's parents are packing to go to Poland and they're blowing up the bridges in his town, so they can't be invaded. And I can go to a posh coffee shop and have in a completely safe place. You know, and the fear of self-compassion is, oh yes, here we are again, all saying, yes, we need to be kind to ourselves. That's why I wanted to be so testing of that, because it could be so indulgent in a world that's, you know, full of horrors. You know, what, I mean, it's too big a question, but where can we go with compassion and self-compassion to help a, you know, hugely troubled world that's always been in trouble, hasn't it? It's not just now. We've just created more and more ways of hurting each other, you know.
Yes. Well, you've mentioned before the issue of the wisdom part, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so look, but let me give you some examples. Supposing there's a fire, right? Would you prefer to have a firefighter who's trained to get, or would you like me to rush in not knowing what I'm doing because I'm terribly keen to save you, right? I think you'd probably choose somebody with some wisdom. So the first thing, right, is what is the wisdom of conflict resolution? Now, there's been lots of studies on this. It's not complicated. There's lots of studies about this. So we can begin to use our wisdom, begin to build up our wisdom about how are we going to sort these conflicts out. So the first part of compassion is then to allow yourself not to know. I don't actually know, right? I don't actually know how to make a vaccine. But I know that was important to do. And I know that there are people that did know, and I know that people that made vaccines. So we, as a group, as a society, we developed the science, we developed the wisdom to create a vaccine, blah, blah, blah. We need to create the wisdoms of how do we deal with these conflicts? Because what we know is if we go back to the primate way of doing things, I'm stronger than you, and I can protect myself from threatening you by threatening you. That is not what the world needs right now, okay? There has to be other ways. So compassion is firstly then become informed, become politically engaged, take an interest, find out what are people thinking about in terms of conflict resolution. Now, there's a whole other issues about should one ever use violence. I personally would probably have been in favor of a no-fly zone, personally, because that was still over the territory of Ukraine. It wasn't going into Russia, and it was just simply saying, look, we cannot allow you to bomb these cities, blah, blah, blah. That might have been a bad idea, not a good idea. So the idea that compassion is never defensive That is not the case.
Yeah.
A good society has a good police force, because we realize that not everybody is, unfortunately, has the opportunity to be compassionate. Some people are not, so they're criminal. And we do a lot of work in the prisons as well. So we work with people who've done criminal things. Okay, so we can certainly be compassionate to them. But the prevention of suffering is extremely important. And in our definition, we talk a lot about the psychology of prevention. So prevention is very, very important. So not only do we need to deal with this situation now, but we also need to think about how are we going to prevent the same old story that we've had for over 6,000 years all over again in another country somewhere, be it Myanmar or be it wherever it is, because we have to find a way as human beings to live together and to prosper together. So, because already I've listened to things on the internet saying, oh, NATO needs to build up, we've had the peace dividend, now we need to build up our weapons, we've got to put the money into the, and these people have probably got a lot of shares of the weapons, for I know, but that is not wise, because we have to see that violence might be necessary, but it's a failure. It's not a success. Creating safe environments where people can feel safe and secure, where the integrated society that's how we feel safe. The same in the Palestinian-Israeli situation. If they treated the Palestinians in the way that we did with Germany and built them up, we'd have a very different case now. So I think we have the wisdoms. We just don't have the political will at the moment to instigate them. So that's why we need everybody now to get politically active and demand that the world finds compassionate solutions to conflict. We demand it, it's not like they're, so that's what I'd like to see.
Well, that's really great. That's really great. Before we finish, I want to just, because I'm thinking of, people watching this, and, we talked globally, we've talked personally. I don't know, and this might not be what you want to do, but I wonder, for someone watching this, say someone like me when I was young, tendency to depression, that you're seeing depression now is becoming a pandemic, and it's, like, used to be the sort of thing that middle-aged men would have, and it's now happening to young teenagers, and it's becoming a major disease burden. And you've written about depression. So let's say someone who's very, very self-critical. Can you what and perhaps they can't afford at the moment CFT or whatever. What would you say to them? How could you help them? Can you help them now? Say, well, here's some things you could do.
Yes. So friendships. I mean, firstly is when you get depressed, you tend to want to socially isolate yourself and not talk to anybody. So the first thing then is to open up a little bit. Now, there are a number of self-help organizations, like there's the one in Mind, and other places. So find out a little bit about other people who are depressed, right? Find out a little bit about them. Realize you're not the only one. Secondly, it's not your fault you're depressed. You didn't choose to have a mind that made you depressed. You didn't go on a course. How can I be depressed today? You didn't practice suicidal depression. I need a suicide, So all of the dark side of the mind, or angers or panic attacks or depressions, they're not chosen. We don't choose them. They just get turned on in us because we have brains where that's capable of happening. And that's true for, as you say, an increasing number of young people. So the first thing is try to, as best you can, not take this personally. I mean, you're feeling it personally, but your brain has gone into a depressed state for whatever reason. It's important to try to figure that out as best you can, but don't blame yourself for being depressed. First thing, very important. Don't, I'm weak, I'm this or whatever. No, depression is a horrible state of mind. I had a depression in my early 20s because I got very angry about something. You can read about it in Overcoming Depression if you want to. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that if you are being driven by self-criticism, realize that underneath self-criticism, right, and it can be horrible, the self-criticism, is what are you yearning for? You're yearning to be loved, basically. You're yearning to be valued. You're yearning to be connected. You're yearning for people to really want to be with you and so on. And so we honor that yearning, and then we think, okay, so now I'm going to be compassionate to my yearning. I'm going to work with my yearning. I'm going to accept it. And if I have to have a cry, then I will. But the key thing then is imagining then having compassionate conversations with yourself. So the next thing is, supposing you could imagine a really compassionate person or a compassionate part of you having a conversation with you, have it. Talk to them. Imagine talking to a really compassionate being, because your critic will just turn up. Wait till your critic turns up and says, oh, you don't want to talk to them? Listen to me, because I know your shit, really. I know you're very crap. So your critic will always turn up, because you don't invite your critic, don't you? You don't say, today I think I need to criticize myself. Critic, could you come and criticize me, please? It never happens like that.
It doesn't know.
No, it just turns up. Whereas your compassionate self, you do need to kind of practice that and develop that and work with that. And the other thing is to always remember that your brain will respond to what you focus on. So, for example, if you're very hungry and you'll see a meal, then that will stimulate your saliva and stomach acids. If you just imagine a meal, it can stimulate the same pathways in your brain. If you see something very sexy on the television, that will stimulate your pituitary, which will give you arousal. But you can just imagine something which will stimulate the same pathways in your brain, just your imagination. If somebody's critical to you, that will stimulate your threat system. But if you run it in your mind, you're stimulating the same pathways. If somebody is kind and supportive to you, helpful to you, that will stimulate particular systems in your brain. And if you do it for yourself, you can do the same. You can stimulate your own brain systems by what you practice, what you imagine, what you think. And then, so it's just a case of then practicing having compassionate conversations with yourself, right? Yeah, you can beat the shit out of yourself if you want to. There's no law against it. But it's not going to do your brain a lot of good. Whereas if you practice the more difficult, the more courageous, the wiser route, which is learning how to support and look after your fears and your worries and the injuries and hurts that you might be carrying, that will help you. And always, of course, if you are really struggling, go and see a GP. It's always very, very important. Go and see a GP and reach out for whatever help is out there for you.
Well, that's a really great place to thank you. To finish, just to say thank you personally for what you've given me. And I hope by our conversation, more people can be helped by you and by what you've discovered in your life's work.
Yes, that would be wonderful. And I just carry all of the things of all the thousands of people over the thousands of years that have all been saying similar things. Anyway, look, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much. It's been